I had been to the cathedral in the city of Oaxaca several times. On a few of those visits, I went inside and took photos. At other times, I would sit on a balcony of a bar across the street from which I would have a good view of the many weddings, pageants, festivals, and other events that took place in front of the cathedral, the proper name of which is Santo Domingo de Guzmán. El Museo de las Culturas de Oaxaca was on my list of things to see, but after seeing Tomb 7, now I wanted to see what had been inside it, so it moved way up on my list. This is one of the shirts I got in Mitla, but that's a story for another episode. After my visit to the ancient ruins at Monte Albán, I made it a priority to go to this museum now that I had learned that many of the artifacts from those pyramids were displayed along with the treasures from the tombs, including the fabulous Tomb 7, which was found intact and yielded kilos of gold. In addition to the artifacts and displays, the building itself was an interesting work of architecture. Like many older buildings in the city of Oaxaca, the museum is a repurposed religious building. The cafe where I did much of my writing in the city was in a building that had been a convent and had a nice open courtyard with tables. This museum had also been a convent and was attached to the cathedral. It contained room after room of local history from the Mixtecs and Zapotecs through Spanish colonialism to more recent events. There had been at least 16 different languages and cultural groups within what is now the state of Oaxaca. As my tour guide to Monte Albán told me, many families, including his own, still speak their indigenous language at home, and many children do not learn Spanish until they go to school. I also learned that according to locals, the proper term for the people, their art, and their food is not Oaxacan. Although spell check does not try to correct Oaxacan, it does not recognize Oaxaqueño, but Oaxaqueño is the local term, and certainly most people from outside the region do call them Oaxacan. This convent-turned-museum was an interesting building in its own right, and I had planned to visit it at some point during my month in Oaxaca, but after visiting Monte Albán and learning that most of the treasures from Tomb 7 were on display in the museum, it became a higher priority. Some of the signs in the museum were only in Spanish, and although my Spanish is far from perfect, I was happy that I only had to resort to Google Translate a few times to comprehend the many plaques. The treasures of Tomb 7 were amazing indeed, and the museum had many of them displayed. One of the many things I liked about the museum was all of the displays were explained with good signage, and much of it was in English. The goldsmithing was really incredible, and even more remarkable how old it was and how it had managed to stay intact over the centuries. There was display case after display case of amazing art and jewelry. I thought it was very interesting that a culture responsible for what I often thought of as barbaric ritual sacrifice is also responsible for such beautiful, intricate artistry. One of the most spectacular pieces was a human skull covered in turquoise. There are several skulls and other human remains in the museum at Monte Albán, but this skull was the most ornate. In addition to the treasures of Tomb 7, El Museo de las Culturas has much more of the history of this fascinating region and city. There is a large library and archive about the past with letters and books on display, and there were researchers using the facility to look at these antique records. There is, of course, a great deal of the museum is about the area's rich indigenous history, and a few other museums in the city also feature this part of their heritage. Of course, this museum has a display about Benito Juárez, who was from Oaxaca and rose to become the first indigenous person to become president of Mexico. This important figure in Mexican history was Zapotec. His home in Oaxaca is a museum to his memory, and I visited it on another of my days in the area. There is a section in the museum on the history of the area after the Spanish arrived and life changed forever for the indigenous people. The guns, swords, and horses of conquistadors allowed them to take control relatively quickly and decisively. I have been to many museums all over the world, and many have left me feeling unfulfilled. I didn't learn much, or they failed to present a complete story from which I could learn. But this museum offered a rather full range of the history and art in a very beautiful setting. The building itself was beautiful and put to good use to display the many exhibits. In the museum, I ran into a young lady who was with her mother and aunt, who I had met on our hike and visit to San Martin Telcajate, where they make the alebrijes. I will have lots more to say about Santo Domingo de Guzmán and alebrijes in future installments, but the next episode of Walts Wanderings will cover some other ruins on the outskirts of the city of Oaxaca. I had a nice little visit with the women while we were still trying to see as much of the Museum of Cultures as we possibly could. It was a lot of space to try to cover, and as so often happens in museums, I'm reminded of the line from the old Frank and Ernest cartoon where one of them says to the other, "How are we going to see everything if you keep stopping to look at everything?" There was even a great view out the back of the building. There was so much more to see and learn inside the museum, it was hard not to get distracted by the beauty outside. There were also sections of the museum dedicated to more modern arts. After Edgar, my hired driver, took me to Monte Albán to see the ruins from which these treasures had come and that were now housed in this museum, he took me to a short side trip to visit the small town of Santa Maria del Tule to visit its famous tree. The tree, a Montezuma cypress, is estimated to be 2,000 years old. It somehow escaped being cut when so many of the other cypresses in the area met that fate. The Tule tree, as it is widely known, is considered the largest in circumference tree in Mexico, if not the world. It stands over 40 meters, over 130 feet tall, and is estimated to weigh 630 tons, and it's still growing. Because of its grandeur, for centuries was considered sacred by many of the indigenous peoples in the area, some of whom performed religious ceremonies under it. According to one local tribe, the tree was the walking stick of a god. The town of Santa Maria del Tule has beautiful buildings, including a well-kept and brightly painted and festooned church built in the 1700s. It was based on an earlier church, which was based on older sacred sites. Tourism based around the tree is responsible for most of the jobs in the town. After the visit to Tule, Edgar took me to Yagul, another ancient site that, unlike the more touristy Monte Albán, has not been restored at all, and we had the place completely to ourselves, as I will cover in the next installment of Walts Wanderings. And I'll also cover my visit that same day to Mitla, another historic site. So subscribe so you don't miss it.